So today we do have our speakers with us. We have Josh, and Josh is the Chief Strategy Officer at Workforce. And then we also have Rick here on the call, who is the Editor-in-Chief of Workforce Magazine. So I'm going to go ahead and hand off to you, Josh.
Thanks very much, Meg. Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining. I think we've got over 200 people on the call today. So we're going to try and keep this fairly quick. Actually, since we sent out the invites for this webinar, there's actually been quite a lot going on in this area. We had the House pass a new bill that sort of covered off on a lot of the content that this is about. So I think it's all moving pretty quickly, but let's get underway. So I think you're probably all pretty aware of the current minimum wage. It's $7.25, which is probably on the low side. But we've had, and I'm sure many of you are aware, that many states have made their own minimum wage laws. In California, we're at about $12. But all over the country, people have been increasing their minimum wage. Florida recently passed their $15 minimum wage rule. So this is something that a lot of businesses have been managing and handling, but the complexity of it is quite high. We have different rates in different states, different counties throughout California, for example. So it is quite a complex area, and that's why we're going to be covering it over the next few months as these changes come through. Many of you are probably aware of overtime kicking in after 40 hours, and but that only applies at the moment to people who earn less than $35,000 a week. Lastly, we have seen Fair Work Week ordinances coming up in places like New York, Philadelphia, and recently in Chicago, which is less about the minimum wage, but more so about the scheduling sort of conditions that you have. But that's kind of not exciting because that's what we already have, and you probably already know about that. This is a bit of a graph just showing you how the minimum wage has evolved over the last 72 years since it was started during the Great Depression. You can see that this is in real terms, so sort of in today's money, what would that buy you? You can see it really peaked around $12 in the 60s, and it's been pretty flat for quite a while, and that means in real terms it's been going down. Can everyone hear me okay? I just saw Richard saying no audio. It might just be you, Richard. Cool, thanks, Jennifer. So we've obviously got a new administration and a new Senate. So we've got a new Labor nominee, Marty Walsh. He's got a union background. We had a feeling from quite a way before this election that an increase in the federal minimum wage might be on the cards, which is why we decided to do this. There's also a few other changes coming. I don't think they're as relevant as most of our customers, but I think we're going to see a big focus on the gig economy. We've already seen some of this in California. The independent contractor test is what says if someone's an employee or someone's a contractor. I think we're going to see some changes to that. We're not going to see any changes to the joint employer test, which I don't think is that relevant to many of you. And I think we are going to see some higher salary thresholds for overtime. So more of your employees are going to be falling into that overtime threshold, and that's more people to make sure that we're reporting properly the hours they're working. So the Democrats have actually already passed this bill quite a while ago. The Republican Senate didn't pick it up. They passed it again. It really goes and just sets out increasing the minimum wage to $15 per hour over the next 4 or 5 years. It also goes and increases the cap on salary overtime to $47,000 per year, which covers a lot more people. It really puts it up into the next bracket. And there's obviously generally broad support for most of the Biden administration's initiatives, given that the Democrats now hold the Senate and the House. Here's a little table, which I think is probably the most interesting thing to probably take away from this webinar. It's basically how the increases are scheduled to take place. And this isn't law yet, so don't go putting these into your HRIS system, but it gives you a good idea of what's coming. You can see we're currently at $7.25, but we're trying to get to 15 by 2025. So that's a nice steady increases for the minimum wage for most people. And I think that does give everyone some time to get used to these and make the changes they need to in the business. I think if you have tipped employees, this is going to happen much more quickly. So you can see, because it's going from $2.13 at the moment to $15, so there's not going to be a tipped minimum, that we're going to sort of move away from that tipped wage idea. This really needs to happen very fast, because we only have 5 years to go from $2 to $15. So I think if you do have tipped employees at the moment and you do make use of the tip credit, this is some fairly major changes coming to your business, and it's things that you probably want to be talking to your business and your operations people about pretty quickly, because we're going to be going from $2.13 to $5 in just a very short period of time. Sort of some more footnotes. If you're paying people a youth wage, that's also getting phased out, and the 14C is more about people with disabilities and things like that. So all of these are sort of being phased out over the next 4 or 5 years. So we've already had the executive order. This is covering federal employees. It's not really probably relevant to most of you. So it's going to be a progressive approach. And I think one of the big things we've seen, and we've seen this in other places, as the minimum wage starts rising, the enforcement of it becomes much more relevant, because less and less people are inclined to do it. So we've already seen that there's going to be a focus on that. More fines. Of course, many of you are probably also aware of the lawsuits that happen when you're not paying people minimum wage. We have a lot of those in California.
Hey, Josh, if I could jump in just for a second, especially on the first point about what OPM is recommending, basically it seems to me that it's something of a trial balloon on the part of the Biden administration. It's just like, okay, we're going to roll this out for federal employees, and then with the 1.9 trillion stimulus act, that's where it seems like it's going to come up for all employers. So I think that's where you're going to see more of an effect on employees. Now, the OPM draft recommendations also includes federal contractors. So if anybody doing business with the federal government is going to, provided that this goes through, is going to have to adhere to that.
Yeah, that's a good point about the federal contractors. I see that we've just put that poll out on the side here. How concerned are you about it? Yeah.
Very interesting.
And I think I was expecting maybe to have more in the not at all category, maybe people who are already paying above $15 an hour. But I think even if you are already paying above the minimum wage, the competition for talent, so like a lot of our clients that do pay above minimum, it was for a reason. They wanted to attract the best people to their company, and that gave them I think we were talking to some clients the other day, Rick, and that was their whole strategy, was they would pay above minimum, and that's how they got better talent. I think
Sure.
Those type of strategies are now going to either be more expensive, you're going to have to pay even more above minimum, or you're going to have to think of other ways to attract staff and keep talent.
Right,
so.
and it's very interesting to note that companies like Target are doing it on their own. And now a lot of these larger companies are implementing a floor of $15 an hour, and then they also include bonuses and those kinds of things. And as we were talking before we actually went on air, Meg was noting that it can create some stress among employees when you implement these wage increases.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I used to be an HR manager in store at Target, and I was there when they were switching people from $12 an hour to $13 an hour as your entry level wage for cashiers, cart attendants, anything hourly. And then something that the employees would get upset about were mostly their managers, because their managers were like, why am I doing all this extra work to only make an extra $2 an hour? So that was a lot of pushback that we got. And we also had a lot of people wanting their pay to be increased. So it's kind of like this big trickle effect where, one group gets a pay increase and not everyone else wants to, or else they just feel like they're not being compensated fairly anymore. which prior to the wage increase, they were completely happy with their pay. So it is something to consider.
I mean, I certainly applaud companies that are taking the initiative to do things like this, but there are potential ramifications that come with it.
Yeah. No, I agree. I experienced it firsthand, but yeah.
Yeah, I think I like the word she's used there, compression. So we're really talking about the phenomenon that if you only get paid an extra $1 or $2 to do a lot more work, why would you do that work? And I think it's quite difficult. And thanks, Phil, for pointing out the proper word for us. Ted, I liked your comment about bidding on competitive government contracts where price is a key selection factor. I don't think that's just government contracts. I think that's everyone. And I think really what we're experiencing here is the rules of the game are changing. It's like we've all been playing a game for a while, and then we've just decided to change the game quite substantially. I think people probably don't realize how big of an impact this is going to have across the whole economy. And it's not just people who are employing people on minimum wage. It's going to really have ramifications throughout. And if we're going to talk about this later, but the businesses that can think of ways to do this without raising prices, I think will have an advantage, and they might be able to gain market share through that. So we're going to talk about some of the options for that at the end, and this is going to be one of the themes we're going to keep talking about throughout. Now, keep those questions and comments coming in. I think that's really helpful. So, yeah, Tracy. Yeah. Sorry, I'm going to stop reading the comments for a while and get through these slides, and we'll come back to the questions at the end. So, yeah, I think this point here is which is a bit harder to model, and I think we'll do some more work around this. But if we're increasing the overtime cap, so more people are getting overtime, at the same time we are increasing the wage. So that's going to have a double-edged impact. So managing overtime, I think, is going to become more important. It's going to be more expensive to pay people that, and it's going to be impacting more people. So trying to keep more people under that 40-hour minimum is going to be important. This is an interesting stat from the New York Hospitality Alliance, basically saying that people will need to increase the minimum wage, increase their prices in the next year. I think we are going to see that across the economy, but there's obviously many businesses that aren't going to be able to do that. If you're competing with imports, if you're in a very competitive industry, it's going to be difficult to do those price rises. And as Ted was saying, it can be a competitive advantage if you can find a way to take in these costs and gain efficiencies other ways without just raising the price. And the last thing is, which is probably very relevant to our audience here, is just the increased pay complexity and making sure that we've got all this covered and we're paying everyone right and covering ourselves from these type of regulations and changes that are happening. And something that we did see in Australia when a similar thing happened, sort of had a federal minimum wage change, is that the level of compliance and the enforcement of that compliance increased a lot. So that's sort of something to keep in mind. How are we going to make these changes? It always happens transitionally. It happens on particular dates. You've got all these changes happening over the next 4 years on top of what the states are doing at the same time. So keeping track of which employees are meant to be getting paid which amounts can get quite complicated.
You know, Josh, just one point on that. Deborah in the comments mentions that we don't have the luxury of raising our rates, and completely understandable. I think you see that occur when we have spikes in gas prices. So we see surcharges, companies implementing surcharges. Same with whenever there's a shortage of coffee beans. We see a spike in the price of a cup of coffee. So I think that's just sort of a natural thing that organizations are going to experience these kinds of stresses. It's just like, what do we do? How do we cover this cost? And it seems like passing it along to the consumer is, especially according to that one stat you showed from New York, is going to be passing it along to customers.
Yeah, I think in terms of how we are trying to help small businesses deal with this, I saw, Rodney, that you've asked that question. I think one of the first things we can do is all understand what's happening, so that we have as much time as possible to communicate, whether it's communicating to customers that there's price increases happening and how we're going to do that, or communicating to employees that, hey, some things will need to change with the way we do things. We will need to be more productive. We will need to do more with less time. I think the longest, whenever you're doing a change, whether it's like implementing a new software system or implementing a new policy, the longer you have to do that change, to think about that change and to communicate that change to everyone and make sure everyone understands why it's happening, that the better it's going to be. And I see Kathy's just saying that she's in a local government context where I don't think raising prices is an option there. So in that case, it might be about, okay, what services are going to need to change? What can we provide differently? So I think there's some very difficult consequences to this that need to be thought out. And this is really what the slide is talking about. So I think everyone automatically, what comes to mind when there's an increase, when the inputs increase in price, we think, okay, let's just increase our price that we pass on to consumers. I don't think that is always a possibility for everyone. We've had heaps of examples of that already. So the other option, and this is a bit of an economic view of it, that if we can increase the productivity of our workforce, then we can cover that cost like that. So what does that mean? And it kind of changes in a lot of contexts, but one of the big clients we've worked with a lot is a pizza chain. And a lot of their productivity was actually driven by like the time to deliver pizza to people. And what we worked with them on was, how do we get the right number of drivers working at the right times so that we're not paying people just to stand around, they're not delivering pizza. We have the right amount of people on when it's really busy at 7 p.m. on Friday night. We have the right amount of people on to deliver that pizza, and we can that means everyone is contributing and being productive at that time. That's obviously different for every business, but what we can start doing those things as you get more visibility into labor costs, and when you can see what are these people doing, why do we have these people on at this time? Do we have the right people on at the right time? And how do we keep people accountable and empower people to manage those costs and be aware of those costs? And I think in the US for a long time, it's been possible to not really focus on those things. There's been more important stuff to work on, like customer service and things like that. And I think this minimum wage is going to really change that, and there's going to have to be a very large drive towards productivity of everyone across the whole company. Anything else around that, Rick? I think we can sort of break this into two parts of what needs to be dealt with here. And there's one part which is just the compliance and the administration of it, which is quite difficult. And I think we're going to continue to create materials for everyone around that, around how to manage that and when these changes are happening, when they're effective. I think,
right.
Yeah. So,
yeah, well, yeah, I would say that, especially in terms of compliance, sometimes these wage increases creep up on you. So let's say for Chicago, for example, it passed the ordinance in 2019, and then maybe you weren't aware of it. Maybe you knew that the ordinance was passed, but you didn't know what, excuse me, the tiered wage increases were. And so all of a sudden, January of 2020, it comes up, and maybe there was an increase, but you weren't aware of it. So it's really important that if you are in a city, state, if the federal government does ultimately pass this, knowing when these increases take place. And so how do you find out that information? How do you make sure that it's part of the payroll process or whatever the process may be for your organization? How do you know that? So Josh, I don't know, what would be a solution to knowing when these wage increases take place?
Yeah, I think that's something that software can obviously help with. I think just staying informed and understanding it is another big part of it. But something I like to suggest for people is to try and have, a lot of people at the moment, when we go and look at their payroll systems or the way they set up their pay, there's a lot of just one-off or ad hoc things that have happened. So like operations manager decides that this person should get paid like $9 an hour, and then someone hard codes that into the system. I think what is definitely best practice is to try and move to more of a pay table system. So where you have some sort of guidelines, which is like, oh, you've worked for the company for 5 years and you're in this role at this location, that means you get paid this much. And some of the flexibility that a lot of businesses have had where they kind of just let everyone decide these things in the field, I think is the sort of thing that is probably worth considering whether that's worth the additional overhead. Because if you don't have a pay table when you're updating these things, it's a very one-by-one, case-by-case basis, and that's not something that's very easy to manage for the HRIS teams or the HR teams that have to do that. But yeah, I saw some really interesting comments about aged care throughout the Midwest, and I think probably throughout at least half the country, where, and this is the thing about a federal minimum wage, it applies federally. It doesn't allow for the local nuances of what economies are like in different parts of the country, and it's a very big country, and there's very different situations. So I do feel for those people that are in, it is going to be very difficult in those places. I think that's where we can, the productivity drive is going to be important to help those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Cool. We're getting towards the end. I don't think we have a lot more to discuss in terms of slides. Do we have any more? Yeah.
I was going to see if there's any additional questions that we can answer in the next few minutes before we wrap up.
Well, Josh, one question that I actually had come up with, and this is pretty basic, but what industries do you think are going to be most affected if the minimum wage does go to $15 an hour?
Yeah, I think anyone who is currently paying a tipped minimum or using the tip credits, I really would recommend getting on top of these changes as quickly as you can and understand how they're going to impact the business, because I think that's just almost certainly going to require a price increase. I think a lot of these comments today have come from people who are going to be impacted. So they're home care, people who are doing work that's at minimum wage at the moment. I think anyone that's in a more regional area where the economies are not as quick and they haven't seen this, there's been no exposure to this, and it's actually been quite possible to live on $7.50 an hour. Like, that's been a good wage for someone. So I think doubling that is going to have quite a big impact on those areas in regional places. I think we already spoke about the healthcare aspects of it, but there's just a lot of work involved in looking after people. And it's very labor intensive, and I think it's hard to get efficiency gains in that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the tipped aspect, because especially right now with people not going out to eat, depending on when all this gets passed, if these employees are not making their tips because the restaurant's not busy, the restaurant has to pay the minimum wage. And if the minimum wage is going up from, in Chicago, if it's like $9 an hour and now it's $15, they're going to have to pay them $15 an hour, when usually tips, because the restaurants used to be busy, would pay that for them. So I think that's going to be a pretty big concern for people in the tip industry, and especially over the past few months with COVID, their businesses have already taken a pretty big hit. So I think it's definitely something to look out for them.
Yeah, and just in case people can't see the comments coming through, Judith was talking about childcare. I think almost certainly that will be impacted. We saw that it was impacted quite a lot in Australia when this happened. I think that's a good question. I don't know if so much so the question is, I'll answer it live so everyone can see. Do you see companies reducing, eliminating benefits to sort of manage this? I'm not sure if we'll see the elimination of things like healthcare, but I think some of the other ones some of the retirement things that are more optional, what I think we almost certainly will see, and one of the first things I noticed when I came to the US was there was a much more relaxed feeling in the US about things like, oh, I need to go to a doctor's appointment, or it's opening day. Lots of these sort of smaller things where people would sort of be allowed to go early, or there was just a more relaxed culture about it. I think we'll see, as the cost of labor goes up, that employers being much more strict around some of these things. So if you aren't working the last hour of the day, you will still put in your PTO request for that. And I think it'll tighten up some of the flexibility that we see at the moment in some employers currently. So yeah, I think people will be looking everywhere. There's not going to be a silver bullet for this. So I think employers will be looking throughout all options to try and see how they handle these changes.
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to your point earlier, where you were saying that to have that competitive advantage in terms of hiring, you want to get the best. And so how do you eliminate benefits and still be able to hire quality people? So it's definitely a difficult decision on their part.
Yeah, Scott, I just saw your question about whether this would be full-time or part-time employees. It's going to apply to everyone, yes. This is not going to be related to their status. Yeah, Rita, I think that's a really good point about annual increases. So this will probably overtake most of those sort of built-in raises. I think people will be aware that these changes are coming and probably be wary of giving people raises before them, too much before them. And that's why they do it transitionally, so that hopefully the productivity keeps up over time. But yeah, I think it's got on there. Michael, yes, we do, based on some of the documents and some of the acts, but I think that's we're still working that out, and we'll keep you posted about that.
Wrap up. So yeah.
Mary, yeah, I think it will, yes.
Or are there more questions coming through?
Yes, we're getting a couple more questions. But...
Okay, go ahead, answer them. Sorry.
Well, that point from Mary about will this apply to an intern? Yeah, absolutely. If you have a paid intern program, yeah, it's absolutely going to, and they're hourly. And yeah, absolutely, it's going to apply to you.
Steve, I think they are trying to change the rules around that as well. We haven't gone into a lot of detail in this webinar about that, but if that is something that people are interested in for contractors and big things, we can go into more detail about 1099 workers.
And also with the intern, I am not sure, but I know at least in the state of Illinois, if you provide college credit, you can sometimes have the interns unpaid. Definitely double check that, but that is an option as well. So, all right, awesome. Well, it looks like those are the last of our questions for today. So just a little wrap up. We really want to thank everyone for their time today, and just be on the lookout for future emails from us, because we will be doing more webinars, usually about once a month. So with that, again, I just really want to thank you for your time, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And we'll also be sending out a video of our webinar to your emails.
Yeah, and from Rick and I, we've got the research team working on this particular issue. We'll be sending out some more resources around this. Something I do want to make is a calculator for working out what level of price increase you'll need. So keep an eye out for that from Rick and I.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Everyone have a great day.